Esther Calder did not flinch when she heard her husband call her the price of a bad winter. She was standing near the tall windows of the Foster house, a glass of cider warming in her hand, and the words reached her the way cold water reaches a sleeper, gradually, and then all at once. Around her the autumn ball of 1851 went on exactly as it had been going on, fiddles sawing, skirts turning, the whole bright machinery of Marbury society humming under the chandeliers. She set the glass down on the sill so that no one would see her fingers had stopped working. She had been married to Theodore Calder for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had learned that the surest way to keep her dignity was to refuse to spill anything. He had not meant for her to hear. That was the part she would turn over later, in the dark, long after the carriages had gone. He had not been cruel on purpose. He had simply forgotten she was a person who could be standing nearby, the way a man forgets the weather in a room he has lived in too long. The Lowell mill was sinking. Theodore was saying to the half-circle of men gathered near the punch table. Foster the banker, old Mr. Langley, 2 cotton brokers down from Lowell proper. Elias had run it into the ground with his soft hands and his soft notions. I married the daughter, I paid the debts, I rebuilt the wheelhouse, and now the Calder mill clears more in a quarter than her father cleared in a year. It was an arrangement, a balance sheet. A man does what's practical. He laughed, comfortable in his own warmth. A wife like that is an obligation you settle once and then forget about. I'd recommend it to any of you. The men laughed too. It was a low, agreeable sound, the sound of men who have eaten well and intend to keep doing so. Esther stood very straight. She had always stood very straight. It was the one thing her father had given her, that no creditor and no gossip and no cold marriage had ever managed to take back. She did not cry. Crying would have meant she still expected something. Instead, she felt a strange, almost peaceful clarity settle over her, as though a long fever had finally broken and left her able to see the shape of the room. So that was what she was. A line in a ledger. An obligation settled once and then forgotten about. She had loved him. That was the foolish, unspeakable truth at the center of it. She had loved Theodore Calder for 3 years, quietly, the way you might love a house you were not allowed to enter. Standing outside in the evening, watching the lamps come on in the windows, telling yourself the warmth in there had something to do with you. She had brought him his coffee the way he liked it, 2 sugars, no more. She had learned the names of all 40 workers at the mill and their children, besides. She had sat across from his mother at supper for 3 years, and absorbed Prudence Calder's small, sharpened comments the way a riverbank absorbs the current, wearing down a little at a time and never once washing away. She had done all of this in the belief that one day he would look up from his accounts and see her, and that on that day the waiting would have been worth it. Now she understood there would be no such day. He had told a room full of powerful men exactly what she was, and he had not even lowered his voice. She found Mrs. Ainsley, the housekeeper, and asked her quietly to send the carriage round. She made her farewells to Mrs. Foster, complimented the pairs, said her head ached, which was not a lie. She did not look for Theodore. On the drive home through the dark, she watched the Varon River run silver under the half-moon, the same river that turned the great wheel of the mill, and she thought about her father's hands. They had not been soft. They had been scarred across the knuckles from 40 years of machinery, and when he died he had pressed something into her palm and made her swear to keep it. She had kept it. It was in the cedar box under her side of the bed, where it had sat untouched for 3 years, because she had not wanted to think about the day she might need it. That night, lying awake while Theodore slept the easy sleep of a man with a clear conscience, something in Esther did not break. It closed. Quietly. Like a door pulled shut from the inside by someone who has finally decided to stop waiting in the hall. Theodore woke the next morning to a house that felt subtly wrong. The way a watch feels wrong, the instant before you realize it has stopped ticking. He could not have said what was different. The coffee was there, as always. But his wife was not sitting across from him, with the small attentive look she usually wore, and his mother, when she came down, found him alone at the long table, the second chair pushed in neat and empty. "Where is Esther?" Prudence asked, not because she cared but because absences were her particular hunting ground. "At the mill, I'm told," he said, and was surprised to find he was guessing. She rose early. This was true. Esther had risen before light and walked the half-mile to the mill in the cold, and the men who arrived for the first shift found Mrs. Calder already there, standing in the wheelhouse with a lantern, looking up at the great beam that ran across the ceiling. The foreman, Jonah Hale, came in stamping the chill off his boots and stopped short at the sight of her. "Ma'am," he said, "you're up before the birds." "How long has that beam been splitting, Mr. Hale?" she asked. She had her father's eye for it. She had grown up underneath beams like that one. There was a dark seam running along the underside, a finger's width and growing. Jonah looked, and his face changed. He was a broad, slow-spoken man of perhaps 40, with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his hands, and he did not say things he had not first made sure of. "A while," he admitted. "I've mentioned it to Mr. Calder twice. He said it would hold through the season." "It won't hold through the season," Esther said. "I've seen one go. When they go all at once, and there are men underneath." She turned to him. "Do we have seasoned oak in the yard? Some enough for a sister beam?" He considered. "Enough if we don't waste it. Then we won't waste it." She pulled her shawl tighter. "Start today. Tell the men why. I don't want anyone standing under that thing wondering." Jonah Hale looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face settled into respect, the kind that men of his sort give rarely and never give twice. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll see to it." It was a small thing, a beam. But it was the first morning in 3 years that Esther Calder had walked into a room and changed it, instead of standing at the edge of it, hoping not to be noticed, and the smallness of the thing did not lessen the size of what it did inside her. She came home that evening, with sawdust on her hem and color in her face, and Theodore, looking up from his accounts, felt the strange wrongness in the house thicken into something he could almost name. The fall deepened. The maples along the Varon turned and then dropped, and the mill ran day and night against the contracts due before the river froze. And in those weeks Esther changed in a way that no one could quite point to, and everyone could feel. She did not announce anything. She did not weep at her husband, or accuse him, or pack a trunk. She simply withdrew the 1,000 small kindnesses she had been pouring into the marriage for 3 years, and she did it so gradually that Theodore could not catch her at it. The coffee was still there, but Mrs. Ainsley made it now, and it was a little too sweet. Esther no longer waited up. She no longer asked how his day had gone, no longer smoothed the air when his mother said something barbed at supper, no longer arranged herself in the doorway of his study in the evening in case he should want company. She had a new life now, and it ran along the Varon. She knew the books at the mill better than the clerk did. She knew which of the workers had a sick wife and which had a son old enough to start. When a shipment of dye came in spoiled, it was Mrs. Calder who wrote the firm in Boston, in a hand so precise and so unanswerable that they replaced the lot without a quibble. The men at the mill began to come to her, not in defiance of Theodore. They were careful men, and he paid their wages, but in the natural way that water finds the lowest channel. She was there at dawn. She listened. She remembered what you'd told her. Within a month, half the running of the Calder mill had quietly transferred itself from the master to the master's wife, and the master, absorbed in his contracts and his standing among the men of the county, did not see it happen. Prudence saw it. Prudence Calder had spent her life being the only woman in any room whose opinion altered anything, and she had not surrendered the title at 60 to a daughter-in-law. She had chosen specifically because the girl seemed unlikely to want it. She had picked Esther Lowell for her son the way one picks a serviceable horse, sound, quiet, unlikely to bolt. The bolting was not in the plan. "You spend a great deal of time at that mill," Prudence said one evening, slicing her meat very small. "People will talk. A married woman, down there among the workmen at all hours, among that foreman." Esther looked up. It was the first time she had looked her mother-in-law full in the face in 3 years. "Let them talk, Prudence," she said pleasantly. "I find I no longer keep my life arranged around what people say." Theodore's fork paused. He had never heard his wife use that tone, mild, even, and entirely beyond reach. Prudence's mouth thinned to a line, and Esther returned to her supper as though nothing at all had happened, which was, somehow, the most unsettling thing of all. He started watching her after that. He could not have explained why. A man does not generally study a thing he has decided is settled, and Theodore had decided his marriage was settled the day he signed the papers that cleared Elias Lowell's debts. But the settled thing had begun to move, and movement draws the eye. He watched her at supper and saw a woman he did not recognize, calm, certain, full of some private weather he had no map for. He watched her ride out in the cold with Jonah Hale to look at the new dam works upriver, the two of them talking the whole way, and he watched her laugh at something the foreman said. It was not a flirtation. Esther was incapable of it, and so in his own slow way was Hale. But Theodore heard her laugh, a real laugh, low and warm and entirely unguarded, and he realized with a sensation like missing a stare in the dark that he had never once heard his wife laugh like that in 3 years of marriage. He had not deserved it. He understood that dimly, the way you understand a sum is wrong before you find the error. He had married a woman, and then spent 3 years treating her as a closed account, and now the account had opened itself to the whole world, and shut itself to him. And he did not know how to ask why. Because to ask why would be to admit he had never thought to wonder. The absence of her attention sat in the middle of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. And the cruelest part was that he had not known the water was there until something disturbed it. The unraveling, when it came on a gray Tuesday in November, and it came through the front door in the person of Mr. Foster the banker, who arrived without his usual cheer and asked to speak with Theodore in the study. "There's a difficulty with the Calder lands," Foster said, once the door was shut. He had the deeds spread on the desk, and his finger rested on a clause. "You'll forgive me. I've been preparing the papers for the expansion loan, the new looms, and my clerk found something I'd assumed was clean. The mill parcel and the river rights." He looked up unhappily. "They were never yours to mortgage, Theodore." Theodore felt the floor of his certainty tilt. "I bought them. I paid Elias Lowell's debts. The whole estate came to me with the marriage. The debts came to you, the estate did not." Foster turned the deed so Theodore could read it. Elias Lowell deeded the mill, the river rights, and the land they sit on to his daughter, by name, 3 months before he died. It's in trust to her, separate from the marriage, separate from his debts. Which is precisely why his creditors couldn't touch it, and you could clear them so cheaply. You paid off a dead man's obligations. You did not buy a mill. You married a woman who owned one, and never thought to read the deed. The room was very quiet. Outside the wheel turned, throwing its endless patient sound against the window. "That can't be," Theodore said, but he heard the weakness in his own voice. He had never read the deed. Why would he? He had assumed. He had built his whole standing in the county, his fortune, his expansion, his easy contempt at the Foster ball, on a thing he had never once troubled to verify, because it had not occurred to him that the soft-handed dead man's quiet daughter might hold the ground he stood on. "It can be, and it is," said Foster, not unkindly. "Without her signature there's no loan, there's no expansion. And frankly, Theodore," he gathered his signature, "there's a question of whether the last 3 years of profit were ever yours to spend. I'd advise you to speak with your wife, carefully." He found her at the mill, of course. She was in the wheelhouse, where the new sister beam ran clean and pale and strong beside the old splitting one, and she was going over the die accounts with the clerk by lantern light. The men nodded to him as he passed, but it was a different nod than he was used to, respectful but with their real attention reserved for someone else in the room. He felt it, and did not like it, and understood, finally, that he had earned it. Esther, he had not said her name softly in a long time, and it came out strangely. "I need to speak with you." She finished her line of figures before she looked up. "About the deed. It was not a question. Foster came to see me first, 3 weeks ago." She set down her pen. "I told him to take his time with you. I wanted to see how long it would be before anyone thought to ask me." So she had known. She had known for 3 weeks that she held the ground he stood on, and she had said nothing, and she had simply gone on running his mill better than he had ever run it, while he looked through her like glass. "You let me." He stopped. "You could have told me." "I could have," Esther agreed. "When, exactly? At the supper where your mother counts how much I eat? At the ball where you told Foster and Langley and 2 strangers from Lowell that I was a winter's bad debt you'd settled once and meant to forget?" She said it without heat, which was worse than any heat could have been. "I heard you, Theodore. I was at the window. I heard every word, and then I went home, and I stopped waiting." He had no defense. He had spent 3 years constructing a man who did not need defenses, who did what was practical and was admired for it, and that man stood in the lantern light now with absolutely nothing to say. "What do you want?" he asked at last. It was, perhaps, the first honest question he had ever put to her. Esther considered him for a long moment. Outside the wheel turned, and the men's voices rose and fell, the whole living engine of the place that her father had built and she had saved. "I haven't decided," she said. "But I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want to spend another 3 years being grateful for the scraps of a man's attention. Whatever I decide, it won't be that. You can sign the trust back into joint hold, or you can't. The loan is mine to grant or refuse. The mill is mine. The land you've been so proud of is mine. And for the first time in 3 years, Mr. Calder, I am not in any hurry at all." She picked up her pen again. He understood he had been dismissed. He walked back out past his own workmen, past the great turning wheel, into the cold, and he found that his hands were unsteady, and that the unsteadiness had nothing to do with money. The county learned of it the way the county learned of everything, sideways, and quickly. By Sunday it was known that the famous Calder fortune sat on Lowell land, that the proud Mr. Calder had married a mill and never read the title, that the quiet wife he had laughed about now held his expansion, his standing, and a fair portion of his pride in her small ungloved hand. The men who had laughed with him at the Foster ball did not laugh now. Foster postponed the loan. The brokers from Lowell, who could smell a shift in the ground the way crows smell a turned field, found reasons to do their winter business elsewhere. And Theodore Calder, who had built himself on the certainty that he was a man who could not be moved, discovered what it was to be moved entirely against his will. What surprised everyone, and what surprised Theodore most of all, was what Esther did not do. She did not ruin him. She had it in her power. She could have called the loan, refused the trust, taken the mill and the land and her father's good name, and walked out the front door into a life that was wholly her own, and the county would have understood it as justice. Instead, she went on running the mill. She kept the men paid. She honored the contracts due before the freeze. And when one of the Boston firms tried to use the rumor of trouble to renegotiate, it was Mrs. Calder who wrote them a letter so cool and so complete that they paid the original price and apologized for the inconvenience. She protected the thing her father had made. She protected the 40 families who lived on it. She simply stopped protecting her husband's comfort, and she let him stand in the draft of his own making and feel it. It was Prudence who broke first. The old woman came to Esther's door one evening. Not the supper table, where she ruled, but Esther's own room, where she had never once set foot. She stood in the doorway in her black silk, and for the first time in 3 years she looked, to Esther, like what she was. A frightened old woman who had built her whole self on being needed by a son who was failing. "You'll take the loom contracts away from him," Prudence said. Her voice was not sharp now. It was thin. "You'll let it all come down around him. I see it. I'm not a fool." Esther set aside her sewing. "Sit down, Prudence," she said, and after a moment the old woman did, perched on the edge of the chair like a bird that does not trust the branch. "I'm not going to let anything come down. The mill will be fine. The men will be fine. You'll be fine. You'll have your supper at 6 and your fire lit and your son's name on the door, the same as ever." She paused. "I won't take the roof off your head to teach your boy a lesson. I'm not built the way you think I'm built. I'm not built the way you're built." The barb in it was so quiet that it took Prudence a moment to feel it, and when she did, something in her gave way. "I was hard on you," she said, with the difficulty of a woman pulling a long rusted bolt. "I thought, a hard woman raises a hard man, and a hard man survives. My husband died and left me a son and a stack of bills, and I made him hard so he'd never be at anyone's mercy. I didn't think a soft thing could." She stopped. "I didn't think you could do what you've done." "I'm not soft, Prudence," Esther said. "I'm quiet. People mistake the one for the other all their lives. It's the most useful mistake in the world. You can find out everything about a house while everyone thinks you're only a quiet thing standing in it." For the first time, the old woman looked at her, really looked, the way Jonah Hale had looked at her over the splitting beam, and what came into her face was not warmth, exactly, but the beginning of it, the respect that has to come first. Theodore signed the trust into joint hold a week later. He did not ask Esther to grant the loan. He did not in fact ask her for anything. He came to the mill one gray morning with the papers and laid them on her desk, and said, "It's yours. All of it, in your name, as your father meant it. I won't pretend I have a claim I never read closely enough to earn." He stood there a moment, this large man who had never in his life been unsure of his footing. "I've written to the firms," he added. "I told them the truth, that the Calder mill is run by Mrs. Calder, and has been for some time, and that they'd do better dealing with her than with me. It's the only honest thing I've done in 3 years, and it cost me less than my pride told me it would." Esther looked at the papers. She did not sign them yet. "Why?" she asked. He was a long time answering. He was not a man practiced in the kind of speech this required, and she watched him hunt for it the way a man hunts in his pockets for a thing he is afraid he has lost. "Because I heard you laugh," he said finally. "At Hale on the damn road. I'd never heard it. 3 years, and I'd never heard my own wife laugh, because I'd never once done anything to deserve it, and I never noticed it was missing until I heard you give it to someone else." He looked at the floor, then made himself look up. "I don't want the mill. I want to have been a man you'd have laughed for. I know it's late. I know I've no right to it. But you asked me what I wanted, and that's the true answer, and I've spent 3 years not telling you a true thing, so there it is." The wheel turned. The men's voices rose and fell beyond the wall. And Esther Calder, who had stood at a window in October and decided to stop waiting, found that the deciding was not as finished as she had thought. "That's the first thing you've ever said to me that I believe," she told him. "Don't ruin it by saying anything else today." It was not a sudden mending. Esther had learned the hard way that sudden things are the ones that split all at once, and she had no intention of building her life on a beam she had not seasoned. She did not move back across the cold distance between them all at once, and Theodore, to his lasting credit, did not ask her to. Instead, he did something he had never done. He learned her. He started coming to the mill not to oversee it but to understand it, and he stood at her shoulder while she taught him the things his own workers already knew. He learned the names of the 40 families. He sat at supper and stopped his mother's barbs himself now, gently before they could land, and Prudence, who had begun, in her stiff old way, to soften toward the daughter-in-law who had spared her. Let him. He brought Esther her coffee one morning, 2 sugars, no more, having watched and learned it for himself. She looked at the cup and then at him and said nothing, but she drank it, and that was a kind of beginning. The winter came. The river froze, and the great wheel stopped, and the mill ran on its stored water, and the families along the Varon came through the cold fed and warm, because the woman who owned the land had made sure of it. And one night in the deep of December, Theodore found Esther, in the study, going over the spring contracts. And he did not interrupt her, and he did not look through her. He sat down across from her and worked at his own papers, and the two of them sat in the lamplight in a silence that was, for the first time in their marriage, not a wall but a room they were both inside of. "My father knew," Esther said after a while, not looking up, "when he deeded it to me and made me swear to keep it. He told me. He said, men will undervalue you your whole life, and one day you'll be glad they did, because they'll never see you coming." I thought it was a sad thing to say to a girl. I think now it might have been the kindest. She turned a page. He should have given me more of his things. His good chair, his charts. I let the creditors take too much because I was too proud to fight for what looked like sentiment. I should have made sure you kept your father's things, Theodore said quietly. I should have made sure of a great many things. And because he had learned, finally when to stop, he said nothing more, and went back to his papers, and let the saying of it be enough. The Marbury Assembly held its spring ball in the long light of an April evening, in the same foster house where, half a year before, a man had called his wife a settled debt within her hearing. The maples along the Varon had budded out, and the river ran high and free with the melt, and the great wheel turned again, with a sound like the world coming back to work. Esther Calder wore a gown the deep red of the first maple leaves, with a small pearl at each ear, her mother's, the only thing she had fought the creditors for and won. And when she came into the bright room on her husband's arm, the talk in it changed pitch, the way a fiddle changes when a stronger hand takes the bow. They knew her now. There was not a man at that ball who did not understand that the prosperity of half the county ran through Mrs. Calder's careful hands. And there was not a woman who had not heard how she had held the mill together through a hard winter and let no one go cold. The half-circle of powerful men that had laughed with Theodore in the autumn reformed near the punch table out of habit, and Foster, raising his glass, said something that was almost an apology and entirely a tribute, and the men murmured their agreement. And this time the murmur had Esther's name in it instead of around it. But it was Theodore who surprised the room. He had not planned to speak. He was not a man given to speeches. The practical men of Marbury distrusted speeches, and so, until recently had he. But somewhere in the warm noise of the evening he set down his glass, and asked the fiddlers for a moment, and the dancing slowed and stopped, and the bright room turned its face toward him, expecting perhaps to hear about looms. "Most of you know," Theodore said, "that I built a good deal of my reputation on telling people I was a man who did the practical thing. I'd like to correct the record." He was not smooth. He stumbled, found his footing, went on. "The mill that feeds this town was built by Elias Lowell and saved this winter by his daughter, who is my wife, and who I undervalued for 3 years the way you undervalue the floor you stand on, until the day it holds you up through something you'd never have survived alone." He turned to where she stood near the window, in the maple red gown, very straight, as she had always stood. "I told a room very like this one, in this very house, that she was an obligation a man settles once and forgets. I was wrong about the kind of man I was, and I was wrong about her, and a man who can't say so out loud in front of his neighbors hasn't earned the right to her company in private. So I'm saying it. Everything I have because she let me keep it when she had every cause not to. That's not a balance sheet. I don't know what it is. I'm only just learning." The room was silent for the length of a held breath. Then someone began to clap, and then the whole bright room was clapping, and Prudence Calder, standing near the wall in her black silk, was seen to lift her chin and look at her son with something that was not far from pride and not far from grief, because she understood, as only she could, Exactly how much it had cost a Calder man to be soft on purpose in front of the world. The crowd loosened, and people moved, and the music started up again. Theodore crossed the floor to where his wife was standing, and he did not take her hand the way a man takes a possession. He held it out, and waited, and left the choosing to her, the way he should have left it to her all along. Esther Calder looked at the man she had loved in silence for 3 years, and then refused to wait for the man who had finally learned to say a true thing out loud in front of the people he most feared. She thought of her father's scarred hands, and the cedar box, and the deed that had let her hold her ground. She thought of the splitting beam, and the new one beside it, seasoned and pale and strong, and how a thing rebuilt right will outlast the thing it replaced. She took his hand, not because the waiting was forgotten. She would never again be a woman who forgot what she was owed. But because she had decided, of her own free will and for her own reasons, that the man holding it out had become someone worth walking the floor beside. They moved out among the others, and they talked with people, and they laughed. Both of them. Now. And the warm light of the long April evening lay over the whole turning room, and over the river beyond it, and over the house at the end of the drive where the lamps were lit and waiting, this time, for them both.